Hi, this is AP Lit, and part of this, guys, part of this video is going to be for the regular class. Thank you. So I'm going to, got the video, I forgot to record it. So part of this would be for 11 honors, because they're going to read the book too. But we're going to start here with Dickinson. Do you know anything about her? What do you know about her? Yeah, and I might have given you some notes, but anything else?
She wasn't famous until after she got out.
Right.
Or a bunch of her poems were done after she died.
That's right. You know anything about her poetry? Some of it, if this is the right word, could be kind of obtuse or obscure. It can be hard to understand. I tend to do the same poems year after year, so I don't see that anymore. But she wrote over 2,000, I think, most of which were published after her death over a period of 50, 60 years. I think in the 1950s they were still publishing some of her poems. Can you imagine what this might even make the news, a lost play by Shakespeare or something like that, something that we didn't know existed. I imagine it's a little bit like that when you have someone famous and then she's still publishing poetry. Yeah.
It says 1286.
I don't know what that is.
Do you think it's a typo in the date? I think it's 1786?
Maybe so. No,
Wait, is that Emily's
1986. I'm sorry, 1886. Yeah. So anyway, let's just take a look at it. This is always a great one to start with. It's real simple. It contains we don't have to look at the questions, but it contains a metaphor that ties the thing together. And remember when we did the sonnets, and I think some of you still didn't get, what do you mean a pattern of images? You know, you were supposed to get an image, and for instance, if it was a nature imagery, you'd have 3 scenes from nature, something like that. And so patterns of images, you just need to start thinking in that, because that's something to write about, because you're looking always, you've got these tools and you're looking for things to say about the poem that reveal its meaning. So she never, I know, ever titled a poem. So they were either numbered or unnumbered, untitled. So they're always the first line of the poem. So let me read it and then ask you those couple of questions. There is no frigate like a book to take us lands away, nor any coursers like a page of prancing poetry. This traverse may the poorest take without a press of toll. How frugal is the chariot that bears the human soul. You might want to look at it again. That's always a good idea. It's real short. Circle, underline, patterns. That should just be second nature at this point. Take a minute to look at it again and look at diction, look at imagery, look at repetition. a couple of minutes, I'm always thinking about it. It's crazy what we're trying to do here. Write a very articulate and insightful essay on this great work of literature. You got 40 minutes to do it. To me, it's almost laughable when one of the things we're trying to teach is to slow down and read carefully, and yet we put a clock on you and say, you got to do this in 40 minutes. So you have about 5 minutes to think about it, write about it. Yeah.
Yes, I always struggle with the length. So like even if I know exactly what I'm writing, like sometimes I'll be shorter than others.
Yeah, I've done that too. I write them too, and I know exactly what I want to do. And I've had the privilege of having read it more than once, and taught it. And the time, it just gets away from you. There's something magical about writing. If you've ever, it can consume you. So you lose track of time because it's so focused. But here, what can we say about it? What's it about? What did the author do to convey that meaning? Anybody want to start? Just spend a few minutes with it. You got something, Ella?
Well, it's comparing literature to transportation.
Right. So the pattern of metaphor that is transportation. So why would you make such a comparison? How is literature like that, and why is that an important point? Nate, what about, why is that, what's the big deal? How is it like, those are two very different things, transportation and poetry. What do they have in common?
Poetry can like transport your mind to a new place type of thing.
Okay.
And so it can take you to places you wouldn't have imagined before. It can like take you away from the reality to like your imagination.
Okay, that's exactly right. The way she writes the poem, how does she take that, and what does she say about that? In other words, you said it'll take you places in your imagination. Anybody elaborate on that? In other words, it's not just space that's traversed, right? It's, well, what are the three forms of transportation? What?
Planes, trains, and automobiles.
Yeah, in this case, what did she use? What kind of boat? A frigate. What's a frigate? I think we're going in circles here. Yeah.
Like a shipping boat, I think.
Yeah, and
There's
usually
always a bigger ship.
it's a naval vessel. I looked it up. They've always been highly maneuverable, so they would be fast, not big, bulky battleships. I used to, we don't have them anymore. It would take over 2 miles, and that would be true probably with aircraft carriers. 2 or 3 miles for them to turn around. Once you start turning, you don't turn on a dime. And frigates were smaller and more agile, flexible. What are the other two? There were frigates during the 1880s, 1890s. What are the other two forms of transportation?
Coursers and chariots.
What are coursers?
I don't know.
No, but you see, and this is another disadvantage. If you don't know what a word is, on the test, you're out of luck. So you have to go with context clues or just wing it. Do you know what it is?
This is a guess, but horses.
It's a battle horse, right? It's all sorts of different kinds of horses, work horses and palfreys, and Middle Ages used to have them all, labeled like that. So it's a war horse. And what's the third form of transportation? Chariot. So here's a way to talk about diction and imagery. Why those three forms of transportation? She could have used trains. She didn't. Couldn't use planes, but she could have used trains. Horses make sense. Wagons. Why those particular, and what are the denotations? We kind of went over that, but also the connotations of those words. Becca, why those three? Now, if you don't know why, that's the wrong question. What's the effect of those three? And why not other forms of transportation? What's it about those three forms? That's a good
So
point.
it's kind of like an individual journey. I guess.
That's a very good point. Yeah, okay.
So if a courser is a horse, he describes poetry as prancing, then she's using the mode of transportation to describe form of poetry.
That's, again, it's talking about diction, very good. That word prancing, poetry, fits perfectly with the horse. Hey, look how short it is. Every word, if you care about what you're writing, every word has to be exactly what you want. Yeah.
To me, when I see the words like there's a frigate with a book, it implies like a large amount of either distance covered or it has a certain weight to it. The you just said there's no boat like a book. The denotation, or the connotation of frigate, to me just kind of seems like it brings more weight than the word boat.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's all good writing is precise or specific. Calling it a boat or a ship, not nearly as, no matter what a frigate is. And I like the sound of it. The Coast Guard uses them now. And I like what you said. Frigates, they go far, you know, they can, and they're flexible, but they can go far. What about a chariot? Do you think there were any chariots in Amherst, Massachusetts in 1886?
Yeah.
I don't.
Well, no,
What do
like,
you-
well, there's, if you're talking about like a war chariot, but there's probably like still like like a,
Do you mean a carriage?
there's carriage, yeah.
Yeah, a carriage is
That
a
would be
chariot,
nice.
and even if they're the same thing, why does she use the word chariot, which I don't think they are, why does she use chariot, not?
I think she uses chariot because that makes you think back to like old Roman times to
Exactly.
show that poetry is timeless.
You hear that? Poetry traverses time as well as space. Like the frigate can get you a long way, but using the word chariot also, and it's interesting, using the word chariot makes you think of the Romans. What about courser? And it's a war horse. Maybe nothing, I don't know, but that sounds medieval to me. You know, we spend all year reading the Middle Ages, about the Middle Ages, and those are things that Saga Roland. So it almost romanticizes this idea of transportation. So you got the Middle Ages, you got Ben-Hur and the Romans, and you got this maybe even a modern, but you had frigates back earlier too. Interesting sailing ship, yes, Owen.
Well, I was just gonna say one thing, like, you kinda just said this, but, each of the things is like something that's very important to, or make very distinctive to each society. So, it, like, the details make it more authentic, and it just like, well, like Clayton said, you can traverse time.
And I like that word, authentic. I like that because why don't you do that? All of you. I mean, why don't you want to make your writing authentic, and it becomes authentic when you use words precisely, and that word frigate has already taken us several places. We haven't moved a muscle, I have, but you pretty much sat there, but the word frigate has taken us in several places, just because it's such an interesting word, yes.
I was gonna say that, like we talked about how each word comes from kind of a different time period, but they also are all involved with like the idea of battle and like going out for war, and so like the author might be trying to say like that by knowing poetry and reading books and stuff, you like are armed for battle, like you have the tools of like knowledge and stuff. So.
Very good, and that's very true. They all have to do with war, and I can't think of anything more romantic than war. And I'm not saying she's a romantic writer, but I mean, think about it. There's nothing more adventurous than war. If you think about it, I mean, there probably are, but it's one of the most adventurous things that writers have been writing about and people have been doing. So she picks one of the highest forms of human activity and says books can do that. There are two last things about this. One is that last, the whole last statement, the last sentence, and it is a sentence, but the last line, how frugal is the chariot that bears a human soul. That says a mouthful right there. What else about reading does that line suggest? How frugal is that chariot that bears the human soul. When it says it's frugal, what does that mean? And by the way, did you know what traverse? That seems like an odd word here. Again, it's just odd, but what makes it so interesting? To cross, right? When you traverse something, don't you cross it? You travel. But why that word? You see, that's where diction comes in, and your curiosity, and you're trying to figure out, what do I say about this poem? Look at those words. Why those words? Yeah.
It kind of feels like her diction is like changing, almost like time, like it's like she goes from more casual to like bigger words like traverse and prancing poetry. It's kind of like, I don't know, it feels like more fitting for each time she's talking about it.
That would be appropriate, the prancing poetry, for instance. But what about frugal? What does it mean? Dave? Well, I like to think I'm frugal but not cheap. See, that's a great example. That word cheap and the word frugal mean basically the same thing. But look at the connotations of those two things. You want to be cheap or you want to be frugal? Most people want to be frugal. So what is it saying, David, about reading?
That you don't have to. That you don't have to.
Yeah.
And even the one beforehand, you don't have to what? The law beforehand said, this traverse the poorest take without oppressive toll. What's a toll? It's a payment.
I was gonna ask, is frugal along the lines of the last goal?
It is. It's more noble than cheap, although it means, in other words, you can buy a book at this point in history. At some points they were extremely expensive, but at this point, you can buy a book without spending a lot of money. And you can look at the value you get out of the little money. No matter how poor you are, you can probably afford a book. And what is the extreme way she ends it? In fact, the last word. That's something to consider. The last sentence, the first sentence. The first word, the last word. That might be an interesting thing to look for when you're looking at poetry. But look at the last word. Consider that contrast of poor and frugal with, what's that last word? What is she saying poetry has the power to do? Like, what is poor? What does poetry have the power to do? It says it bears the human soul.
Want me to answer?
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
Sorry. When she says that, it kind of just reiterates the point of the poem, saying that, you know, poetry is so powerful and it's so cheap, but yet it can do the big task of transporting a human soul somewhere else.
It's not just the imagination anymore. It's something bigger than that. It's the soul. And so something that powerful, you can't do that with a trip to anywhere. Your soul cannot be transported anywhere. Your soul's going with you, and it's going to stay just like it is. But poetry has, in her opinion, has the power to change it, to take it somewhere. So if you were going to write, I want to get to this other thing, but if you were going to write the meaning of this poem, anybody want to try your hand at it? Just putting all that together. First we said it can carry your imagination. But if you add all the other details to it, what else has she said about poetry? The power of it. Anybody want to try your hand at, yes, Lily?
Poetry never fails to change the human soul in some way.
Yeah, exactly. The human soul, transcends space and time. And it's just beautifully done. So, and this is, I can't take credit for this. I always like to think the Lord does some of these things for us, but it's an amazing transition from that poem and what we're going to look at for the last few minutes, last 25 minutes of class. The next book you have in front of you is by Stephen Crane, who was a contemporary of Emily Dickinson. And so if you would get out some notes, I want to give you a few details about, I'm asking you to read the first 40 so pages by next Thursday. Do you know anything about Stephen Crane? And this is where the 11 honors kind of kicks in here.
Did he write 30,000 Cures?
That is an odd thing, but yes, he did. You don't know much more though, right? You wrote this book we're getting ready to read. Well, I have an interesting story. The editor of this book, I think it's that way I saw it, the editor told a story about Stephen Crane, that he was invited, a young fledgling author. He died when he was 29, so I don't know how old he was. This young author was invited to a party, and I can't even remember, I'll look it up, but the writer was an established, well-known art writer. And he invited a lot of writers to his party. And, yeah. He said about Stephen Crane, and the aspirant, this young writer who went to this party, was a curious man to look at. Although he was barely 21 years old, his face and body had already shown signs of wear and abuse. He stood 5 feet 6 inches tall. You know, people are taller. 5 feet 6 inches tall, average for a man of his day. A few years previously, during 2 unsuccessful semesters at 2 different colleges, so maybe that would give you some hope. You know, colleges teach Stephen Crane, but Stephen Crane couldn't last in a college. Isn't that interesting? He weighed in at a taut 125 pounds, muscular and agile enough to stand out on a college baseball team. It goes on to say that he was invited to this party. Oh, Hamlin Garland, I've heard the name. Anyway, the guy who had the party brought out a book and read from it, and it changed Stephen Crane's life because of the voice of the author. And of course, the book was a book of poetry, and it wasn't a book because she hadn't published any. Most of them were when she died. But it was a poem by Emily Dickinson. I can't think of any two more different people than Stephen Crane, as you'll see in a minute, and Emily Dickinson. I don't see any Emily Dickinson in Stephen Crane's work. And yet, apparently what she did, she inspired him, because here's a woman who spoke in her own voice. And I think that's what encouraged him to be himself as a writer, try not to be somebody else. So, here's a little bit, I don't know if we'll finish it, but a little bit about, it is a Civil War book. It is considered maybe the great American war novel. And there are a few questions. You can write these down if you want to, but we are going to answer them. I'd like for you to know these. I like people that are creative, people that invent things or write things or compose things. I always like to read about, what inspired them to do that. And so his life experience contributed to his being a great writer. And I think it's my job to introduce you to other titles, so just you need to know that. We're going to review these two things. Naturalism, in this case, is a literary philosophy or movement. Impressionism is primarily an art movement. Any of you know what that is? I know you did something with Ms. Roberts back in the fall, didn't you, about art, music, and romanticism, and I don't remember what the three were. Baroque, wasn't it Baroque that you did? Anyway, Impressionism is, I know, you will know as much as I know about it, which I'm not going to tell you much, and that's about all I know about Impressionism. We'll look at the structure and theme of the novel, and I know you've just started the Civil War, and so you've done Manassas, right? You've done Antietam, is that right? The other class told me. Well, this battle takes place after those two battles, and we believe that this battle is the one that Crane had in mind. He never mentions the word Civil War, North and South, Union or Confederacy. He does mention the color of their uniforms a couple of times. The flag, it's debatable because both flags, as you know, were red, white, and blue. So it's really interesting. He never mentions Chancellorsville, but it's kind of interesting to look at the fact it could be, it might have been that inspired him. So 1871, he dies at age 29 at 1900 of tuberculosis. One of 14 children, a Methodist minister. He's a skeptic, and somebody last period pointed out, I said, what do you associate skeptics with, and what does that mean? Do you know what a skeptic is?
A doubter.
Yes, particularly a religious doubter. Usually think of it as they sometimes call themselves free thinkers. Those are basically atheists or agnostics.
Built different,
What?
built different,
I'm sorry, I just couldn't hear you.
built different.
Okay, what do you say? All right. Kind, devoted to animals, seemed like a nice kid.
Different?
Sports was a big deal. Remember, he did play college baseball. Did anybody know the history of baseball? If you could do a research paper, I think that would be one of the coolest things to do, is a sports-related historical research paper. I don't know how controversial that would be, and I know it's gotta have an element of that, but I love the history of baseball. Do you know how long it's been around? And we invented it, or at least our version of it. Have any idea what century it started, or what decade? Yeah,
Well, wasn't it the, 18th century?
Yeah.
you're talking 1700s?
Yeah.
Well, now you know something I don't know, because in America, I know that it's history in America, and if it goes past that, which I'm sure it is adapted, what do you know about it in the 18th century?
It was original.
Well, didn't it come from like an Indian,
That's
like?
the cross.
No, but I've kind of similarities with it. I don't know.
Lacrosse was a game that the Native Americans played in Atlanta.
Yeah, and the British have that. Have you ever studied cricket as a game? You can score 100 points before the next team gets to bat, and it could last 2 days. I don't get it.
Oh, it can last a week, it can last a week.
I don't get it. And they're very good in India. India, Pakistan are really good. The British, of course, play. 1840s, late 1840s, it was the first organized baseball game was played. Anybody know, I'm getting off the subject, but I love this. Anybody know who invented it? Oh, no, who invented the rules for it? We probably don't know a person who invented baseball. But the modern rule, it's usually associated with Abner Doubleday, who was a general at Gettysburg, and he was born in where's the Hall of Fame up there in New England? The Baseball Hall of Fame?
No.
There's a movie
That's no
called,
football.
there's a movie called The Ridiculous Six with Adam Sandler.
Oh, no.
And in it, they show like the creation of baseball. But
Wasn't the guy just sore
it's
loser?
John Turturro.
Yeah.
He's like making up the rules as he goes.
Yeah, I heard it.
They make
I
rules.
heard it was like the
Sounds
guy was a
familiar.
sore loser and he didn't want it, so he kept pushing it.
Well,
like
it's
3
been
strikes.
associated with Doubleday, but it's incorrect. A guy named Alexander Cartwright invented the basic rules. And last question, trivia question. Anybody know what the first professional baseball team, and it still exists,
Red Sox.
where you've got the right color, but the wrong
White Sox.
city? It's the Cincinnati Reds. And they were, the team was created in 1869, I'm pretty sure about that, but baseball had been around for about 20 years under those rules. Anyway, I just think it's interesting that by this time, what we still know, some sports are existing. Lost interest in church, attended Syracuse, apparently another university or college, unsuccessful. But this is what made him, and that's his work as a war correspondent. And so he traveled to Mexico, almost got killed to cover some sort of war disturbance. Went to Greece and covered the war between the Greeks and the Turks. Covered the Spanish-American War in Cuba. So even though he never fought in war, he covered it and saw it and has been around it. Now this war, the War of Red Badge, he was too young. He was born in 1871, had been over for 6 years, but he knew people, and lots of veterans still were alive, and he interviewed them for this book. He survived the sinking of a ship. He wrote a short story called The Open Boat that we believe, I always think it's off the coast of North Carolina, it might have been, Florida. And people, you know, in different, occupations kinda hang around together. So he knew Henry James, it's a British writer. Joseph Conrad, we will read him, later in this spring, Heart of Darkness. And H.G. Wells, wasn't he the, War of the Worlds guy? And I read some H.G. Wells, and that's a great story. You know, if you've seen movies about it. Yep. What?
It's weird.
Yes, but it's just fascinating, and
Is he
I'll,
also the time traveler? So is that someone else?
yeah, what's that called,
The time traveler?
yeah, Time Machine.
Time machine.
Did, and,
Hot tub time.
That's such a weird.
one of my grandsons saw it as the Tom Cruise version of it. It's, to this day, scared to death of that
What
movie.
is the
The
time
Tom-
machine or the?
Time Machine. No, I'm sorry, War of the Worlds, the, Tom Cruise version. So he died when he's 29 years old. But just notice though, he wasn't in war himself. It wasn't like he was unfamiliar with war. And I think you gotta at least have that. You gotta somehow to know your subject, either do the research or go through it yourself. Neat thing about reading, you don't have to go through it yourself. You can just read books about it. And here's some other works. Maggie was a book about a prostitute, so it was kind of controversial. I've read it. It's not sensational, not graphic, nothing like that. I mean, that's not a very sensational job. It's still to this day a very, very sad job. And so I remember the book was dark. Red Badge wrote some short stories. I think you're gonna read one, maybe one with Ms. Roberts. And Bride Comes the Yellow Sky, The Open Boat, Blue Hotel. I don't remember much about that. I think it was the Blue Hotel that she's often taught, or somebody did. And the next few slides, and then just some notes about the movements, Impressionism and Naturalism, the first being Naturalism. It's good to know those because both have an effect on this book. Romanticism is not the movement, and it is, Naturalism is an offshoot of realism, which we're reading that book, or we just wrote about it yesterday. That's kind of a great example of realism is Huck Finn. This is also realistic, but also naturalistic, and you'll see why when you read it, and I'll give you that definition.
What was the Blue Hotel about, you know?
To me, it was not a lot happened in it. It was about some Swedish guy, and all these take place out west, except the Open Boat. They take place, I don't know, Kansas, Wyoming, I don't know, someplace further. And I can't remember much about it. It's about the people that are in this hotel. All right, so naturalism, definition would be that they believed that man was an animal who responded to environmental forces that's outside yourself and internal stresses inside yourself over which he has no control or knowledge. So in other words, most of the things that happen to us are out of our control, and our life is determined by things. We have very little free will. And I asked the last class, we're not going to have as much time now, but I'd love to hear your views of predestination and free will. I know Dr. Talbert's done that with you in theology. And it used to be, students would come into, when Mr. Storch used to teach it, they'd come into the AP and they'd be arguing about free will and predestination, and those were fun discussions. I mean, people get real heated over it, and I don't hear that anymore. What's that?
I mean, that sounds nice, because We got heated over Jeopardy last class.
So you're saying that we need to up the ante a little bit,
I don't know.
talk about some, maybe more,
Keep imagining us doing that sounds scary.
you mean,
I can talk more.
this group.
Blood will be spilled.
More
Okay,
relevant.
just make sure to split
That's
this up
what
between
we
girls
did
and guys.
Yeah.
Well, hey, don't do that naturally anyway.
Moral relativism, Steve tell you all about that. Absolutism. I can tell you.
I can tell you about the guy who wrote the.
Doesn't that fascinate you though?
No.
Does that not fascinate you, those discussions, to this day, fascinate me, I love hearing them. All right, so there are three names in this time period that affected the culture, and they were Darwin, Marx, and Freud, and each of them, in a sense, was a determinist, and determinism, to skip just a second, is the theory that acts of the will, occurrences in nature, so your will deciding to do one thing or another, or what happens in nature, or social or psychological issues, occurrences are usually, or causally determined by preceding events or natural law. So nothing is kind of original. It all is, this happens because something else happened, and it's sort of, this couldn't happen any other way. So it was kind of determined. So Darwin was the biological guy, determinism. Marx, the economic and social determinism guy, and Freud, the inner and subconscious determinism. So they believe that, they would lead people to believe, like Stephen Crane, that you have very little control over your life. That you're almost, it sounds almost robotic to me. And so I'd love, I would like to show you the next definition, but predestination and free will is an interesting topic. So do we have a free will? That's, yeah.
I would say that we have a free will, but because of like, we are ourselves, like, and we're exposed to the things around us, we're always going, like, God knows which thing we are going to decide, because that we are ourselves and the things that we experience make sure that we are gonna choose A or B.
But very interesting. And of course, well, a part of the argument would be, if God knows it's gonna happen, how could it not happen? That's always gets me. You know, if he knows it, isn't that the same thing as saying it can't happen any other way, or he causes it to happen? If he knows it, then you're compelled to do it, right? Like if you do something and he knew it forever, how could he see the future and you do anything but what you do? That always got me. I don't know how I could argue that, but anyway. All right, so he was I think that I would summarize what we just saw is that these naturalists believe that man and woman are victims of forces outside of your control. So Crane, as a writer, believed that even fiction should be scientific. And that causes and effects and circumstances should be shown, to be the result of other forces. And he wrote about violence a lot, mentioned the prostitute and these characters in some of those other books, stories. Trapped and defeated characters, not traditional heroes, like the epic hero of the Middle Ages, or even the romantic heroes of the 1800s, but heroes that you admire, but they're trapped. They can't do anything else, can't do anything, and they're defeated. And just depicting the harsh miseries of life. And the next one is really something, as I mentioned, I know very little about, and it's the art movement called Impressionism. Do any of you know what that is? I would probably defer to you if you feel like you have. Well, I'll show you what I know.
Is it like Dali? Is Dali impressionist?
I don't think so. I think he comes later. most impressionists were 1800. What do you know, Ken?
Isn't it like expressing things artistically in terms of how you perceive them or feel about them instead of reality?
Well, that's exactly, basically what I'm gonna give you in a minute. It's your impression of things rather than the thing itself.
Dali is an impressionist.
Okay, but he is modern, more modern, right?
Yeah, modern impressionist.
Okay. Well, what do y'all know? Do you know anything? Can you add anything to what it means to be impressionist? Besides that, that's accurate.
They focus a lot on dreams and like what they, well, at least Dali did. But like what he would dream about, he would end up, is really like realistic, but at the same time like not realistic as in like the world, but like what his mind is thinking. So it's like
Right.
imagine.
Yeah, okay, I think we can all agree that that makes sense. So it's your impression, or the effect that something has on you is more important than the thing itself. So the presentation of characters or scenes or moods as they appear to the, as you said, the author's individual temperament at a precise moment in time. And down here it says, instead of painting a tree, if you're an artist, you're painting the effect of the tree, or the impression the tree makes on you, which doesn't do me any good, because I like to make my own impressions, thank you. I'd like you to just show me the tree and let me have my own, make my own impressions, or have its impression on me, rather than you tell me what you thought of the tree. And the 19th century, you guys, were definitely, these are all French, Manet, Monet, or maybe some of them are Dutch or something, well, Van Gogh. And I don't know, you can't see this very well, but you've seen this picture before, right? You know, the Starry Night, you know this, I'm gonna turn the light on.
Yeah, I can't see it because it's in the.
So you have seen this, right?
Yeah.
Starry Night, and it's Van Gogh, and so I don't know if he's an impressionist or not, but somebody pointed this out. If you look real closely, the lines, most of the lines are not connected to each other. It looks, instead of taking a brush and just swiping it across the canvas, you'd take that same line and you'd make that line individual stroke marks that are separated from each other. Now, that's kind of what they're getting at here. That, first of all, it is about the impression and not the object itself. Yes.
What do you think separates that as like a good piece of art from other pieces of art?
I wish I could answer that question. I wish I knew. I took two just appreciation classes in Carolina, and one was music appreciation, which I love, and one was art, which I didn't get. So I wish I knew more about art. I love the music. I guess I like music better than art, but yeah, I don't know.
Can you sing us a song?
Does it just make an impression on you? No pun intended, but I like it. I've always liked it, and
I think it looks good, but I don't, like, I could see Miss Welch painting that, like, I don't think it's like extremely talented.
But he was the first.
Like, when I
But
see
he
Bob
did it
Ross
first.
paint
He did it
something, I'm
first.
like,
It's like finders keepers, my guy.
yeah.
see, I'm where you are. I know there's differences. What makes good art? It's not all your subjective opinion of it. Do you have something?
I was gonna say, I love Van Gogh.
Yeah.
I
I like the colors of Van Gogh. The colors are stunning if you look at them.
His other works too, like, I don't know why that one's the most famous, but
Yeah.
he has a lot more, landscapes that I find even more like.
I don't have time to play this for you, but it was a great '70s song by Don McLean.
Oh.
And Don McLean wrote, the one about, American Pie, you know that one. Bye Bye, Miss American Pie, drove my Chevy to Levy, it made him a lot of money. He also wrote one called Starry, Starry Night, and it was about Van Gogh. It's really poignant, because Van Gogh was a heartbreaking character. You know much about him? He died probably of insanity, would probably kill himself. He was a believer, maybe. He went into kind of missionary work at the beginning, and just heartbreaking story. Lust for life. It sounds like it's some X-rated thing. It's about his life. Lust for life. It was a really good biography about him. It just breaks your heart, and the song does. I'll play it for you. next week.
No.
Says the world was not made for someone as beautiful as you, and that's just kind of the, you know, he was just so fragile, he couldn't survive. Anyway, beautiful tune also. And finally, and we'll get into the book Monday. I'll show you the rest of these. But how does this translate to literature? You know, how do you get those brush strokes, if that's impressionism, that are not connected? Well, in literature, the sentences are not connected. The whole thing seems disjointed. Sense impressions are not connected. Vignettes are lots of brief scenes. And use of contrast, black against bright, or colored lights against gray. And you'll see that as you read through this. As this unit is charging across the field, they can't see anything because of all the gun smoke and everything. All of a sudden, the sky opens or the clouds part, and he sees this dazzling blue sky or dazzling green grass. It's really, I like that part of the story. And so there are all these things that happen that are unconnected, like an episodic novel like Huck Finn. Howard's the Duke and the King connected to the Wilkes, connected to the Sherburne and Boggs. Only thing that connects them is the person who experiences them, and that's Huck and Jim. And so Impressionist writing is connected to that. It's connected like that. So there's just a couple more left that deal with the book. I'm going to ask you to read just their 40 pages, as I said, for next Thursday. And I'm still working on the poetry papers, but I will work on all that. Definitely get those back to you early next week. But I'll be working on the others eventually. I'm not for you, but I'm gonna go ahead and turn it so I can get it on recorded. This is theme and structure of the book, Red Badge of Courage. Yeah, we'll do this. This is for the video, really. You don't have to write it down. I think there are just 2 slides left.
I just had a flashback when Dr. Tower was fighting inside those cabinets. Dave, are you gonna use it?
There we go.
Gets me. Mr. Brown, would it be okay if, so I have a study hall at the end of the last period on Tuesday.
You need morning period. Or end of the
It's
day.
afternoon, yeah, it's at the
Okay,
end of the
that's
day.
fine with me.
Okay,
That's perfect,
okay,
yes.
perfect. Yeah.
And I have a study hall the first period Tuesday morning.
Right, did you tell me that already? I think-
Yes,
Okay.
and so is that okay if I take it that morning?
Yeah, so Robin can do it in the morning, you can do it
Yes,
after.
yeah, yes.
Both Tuesdays, right?
Yes.
Okay, all right, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Cox.
Yeah, you're welcome.